What's up and welcome to another episode of Gizmo Slip Tech. Today we're taking a look at the MSI GS66 Stealth. This is one of the ultra high-end, ultra portable gaming laptops out there. The competition for this thing is like the Razer Blade 15 and the Aero 15. Super slim, super powerful laptops that basically the goal is to take as much power as you possibly can and pack it into as premium and tight and kind of expensive laptop package as you can. And MSI does an incredible job packing a ton of performance and features into this GS66 Stealth, but that's all on paper. Does it actually pan out in real life? Let's find out. Here we go. Now, it is my dream to become a full-time tech reviewer, and if you want to help support that dream, there's a subscribe button and a notification bell if you want to hit those. Also, the like button doesn't hurt. And if my reviews help you decide on a laptop sometime in the future, I do have affiliate links in the description down below that does go to help support the channel. That said, this video is not sponsored in any way, and this is my honest and true opinion. So let's take a look at the specs on this machine and also the potential configuration options that you have. Now, there's a huge range of potential prices on the GS66 depending on which GPU, CPU, how much RAM, and how much storage you get with the machine. The particular model that I have here has the i7 10875H, 32 gigs of RAM, the RTX 2070 Super Max Q, and a 512 gig SSD with a 300 Hz display, which is becoming the standard for a lot of high-end gaming laptops. Let's go ahead and hop into some benchmarks and see how well this GS66 performs in some actual tests. First up, we have 3D Mark Time Spy graphics. We got 7,418, and as you can see, this is very close to last year's RTX 2080 Max Q in the Alienware, so that's really impressive. Though you can see that the RTX 2070 Super Max Q trails last year's RTX 2070 Max Performance, the non-Max Q version, and the Aorus 15 there. So if you're looking for the most bang for the buck, generally, I don't recommend a Max Q laptop, but the Max Q laptops are really nice when you want to have the maximum amount of performance in the most portable form factor. Speaking of form factor, taking a look at 3D Mark Time Spy points per pound, this got 1,568, which is just freaking insane considering this is an RTX 2070 Super. So if this was an RTX 2080 Super, which they do have a model of this with that, we'd be at the very top of the charts with this machine out of all the laptops that I've tested so far. Now, when we move on to points per dollar, the GS66 still does quite well, surprisingly, because typically the smaller form factor laptops that have ultra high performance in a portable form factor, they tend to cost a really big premium. And in this case, the price is more than what you'll pay for some of the competition if you're willing to get a thicker laptop or a laptop without as many premium features. You can certainly get better bang for the buck out there, but this is still very good bang for the buck all around, I think, for its size. As you can see, the GS66 is ahead of a lot of the competition there, with several Alienware and Razer laptops beneath it. Moving on to Cinebench R20 Multi, we got 3,483. That's the best throttled score, meaning if you were to run Cinebench R20 in a continuous loop, this would be about the average score you should expect. And you can see that this is a little bit behind the Razer Blade Pro 17, which is really interesting because they have the exact same processor, and yet the GS66 Stealth actually has an increased power limit that's a little bit higher than the Razer Blade Pro 17's power limit. Now, the Razer Blade Pro 17 has a 55 watt power limit when under a CPU only load, where the GS66 Stealth had a 65 watt power limit. The really interesting thing here is that the Razer still manages to outperform the GS66, and that's because Razer did not lock down the voltages, allowing me to undervolt the Razer Blade Pro 17, where MSI did lock down the voltages, causing a performance gap, if you will. You can't change the voltage, you can't undervolt the GS66 Stealth for that additional 5 to 10% performance difference. Now, when it comes to Cinebench R20 points per pound, this comes in third out of the recently tested laptops with 736 points, which is quite good. I mean, we've got an 8-core CPU in here, so if you're looking for a machine that you can take around, play video games with, or do CPU renders, this is a solid choice. When it comes to points per dollar Cinebench, this is not the best bang for the buck when it comes to CPU performance. If you're looking for something that's small and lightweight that's a little bit cheaper, there's also the Zephyrus G14, which has exceptional CPU performance for the money. I did make a review of that laptop, and if you want to check it out, I'll have a link at the end of this video. Now, when it came to rendering a 4K file in Handbrake, we came in at 9 minutes and 55 seconds, just 2 seconds longer than the Razer Blade Pro. So that's a pretty good time, especially considering this is a quite a bit smaller machine than that Razer Blade Pro 17. Here we're taking a look at the throttled power limits. First of all, these top two numbers, we get the dual load stress test power limit. When we're taxing both the CPU and the GPU at the same time, you're looking at up to 63 watts of power being continuously put through the CPU and up to 78 watts of power put to the GPU on average. Even if you go from the extreme performance profile all the way down to like the lower or silent, you're still getting the full power limit on the GPU, but the power limit on the CPU gets significantly throttled down. Taking a look at the fan noise, you can see that when we're in silent mode, these fans are barely audible at 41 decibels, basically completely quiet. If we run in balanced mode, we've got 47.9 decibels, and if we go to performance mode, we get 51 decibels. If we go to max fan, this thing gets very loud at 56.6 decibels. So if you're someone that wants a quiet gaming laptop, this is certainly one that can do that. But of course, with reducing the fan noise, you are going to have power limits applied to the CPU that reduces your overall performance in CPU-bound games. So really high FPS games like Fortnite that are CPU bound, you're going to see slightly reduced performance in these lower power profiles, but I mean, it's still going to be really good. It's still going to be like 150, 200 FPS. Taking a look at the temperatures here, you can see that in the dual stress test, that means we're running the Heaven benchmark at the same time we're running the Firestrike CPU test. This is basically as taxing as it can get on a laptop. We've got 65 degrees on the GPU and 91 degrees on the CPU. So we're running very high CPU temperatures on average when we're on a dual load, and that's because of these shared heat pipes between the CPU and the GPU. So when the GPU heats up, there's not as much thermal headroom for the CPU anymore, so the CPU tends to run at higher temps. If you want to reduce these CPU temperatures, my recommendation would be to apply a lower than default power limit to the CPU and therefore get that reduced temperature. But overall, the GPU temps are exceptionally good on max fan, and they're very good on normal fans, default fans. The only GPU temp that's a little bit high is when you go to silent, which basically makes the laptop super quiet. You get up to 84 degrees, which is still good, but you're still getting the maximum performance on that GPU at 78 watts of power. So if you're okay with higher temperatures, the silent mode will basically make this thing insanely quiet if you're very sensitive to noise, and you still get a lot of performance. How much performance? Let's take a look at the actual clock speeds measured during the stress test. So during max performance and max fan, we got 1,536. That's kind of like the benchmark, like the highest level performance for the GPU. And then we have just slightly reduced performance in the other mode. Now, when it comes to CPU performance, that's where you get the biggest hit by reducing the fan noise. If you're on max fan, you can expect 3.6 gigahertz approximately. And if you go down to silent mode, we're running basically base level clocks here at 2.5 gigahertz. What that means is that if you want the best overall frame rate in the CPU bound games like Fortnite, you'll want to run that max fan extreme performance mode. If I owned this laptop, I would probably run it in performance mode with default fans, so that way you get a nice blend of fairly quiet fans with still very high levels of performance. Now, one thing I want to point out is that the chassis right here along the palm rest doesn't get uncomfortably warm, but it does get like noticeably warm. It doesn't stay super cool like on some laptops that I've been testing recently. And that's a little bit disappointing, but I guess that's one of the drawbacks of having a super thin laptop that's also all metal. So that's the performance we got in the synthetic test that I do on every machine. But what about some real games? Taking a look at the 1080p gaming benchmarks, Red Dead Redemption runs excellently at 57 frames per second on average on Ultra. If you go down to balanced or low, you can get quite a few more frames per second. Red Dead Redemption 2, very difficult game to run. 57 frames per second is quite good. Now, Valorant ran at 233 frames per second on average in my test, and that's at all max max settings, so not quite as high as on some of the other laptops that I've tested recently, but that's still very good, and that can help take advantage of that 300 hertz display. In The Witcher 3, we got 110 frames per second, Far Cry 5, we got 104, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider got 96. That's all really good frames per second, and obviously extremely playable. This goes to show you that there's only going to be a select few games like the esports, really optimized titles that can take advantage of the 300 hertz display. Now if we take a look at how the Far Cry 5 benchmark stacks up with some of the other laptops I've tested, you can see that 104 FPS is quite good, even though the Aorus 15 and the Alienware M15 both scored higher than this machine in the synthetic time spy test. The GS66 still managed to outperform those two laptops when it came to real world gaming benchmarks. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we got 96 FPS, which again outperforms the RTX 2080 Max-Q from last year, so I think that's really impressive. Really good when it comes to real life performance, and kind of is like a cut above, if you will, compared to last year's GPUs. Now this laptop speakers are very loud, but sadly they are not very good quality. At 85 decibels, that outperforms the vast majority of gaming laptops out there, but the mids and highs sound a little bit muddled, and the bass just feels less authentic. It's like you've got it all covered in a sheet of metal, which you kind of do on this machine because the speakers are right here behind these two slits, but the audio just can't escape, I don't think, through these narrow slits. It's just not that great of an audio experience, in my opinion. Now, when it comes to the 300 hertz display, we've got 91% sRGB, 73% Adobe RGB, solid sRGB and Adobe RGB numbers, about average for the 300 hertz displays that I've tested so far. Now, I think I've been spoiled a little bit from the Razer Blade Pro 17 display. It's a 4K, 120 hertz, 440 nits brightness display with 100% Adobe RGB. It's like the dream display in my opinion, because it allows you to game at higher resolutions when you want to, or down res the resolution if you want to. So in my mind, I would love to see a display like that put on a machine like this in the future, and I hope in the next year or two we might see 15-inch laptops with a similar style of display. Ideally, I would love to see a 1440p, 144 hertz, 100% Adobe RGB, 400 nit brightness display on gaming laptops in the future, at least in the premium category. There's no reason why we can't have that, I don't think, at this point. We just gotta make it happen. Overall, I think the vast majority of people will be very happy with the display on this unit. It's colorful, it's bright enough at like, I think it's about 296 nits, so basically 300 nits brightness at the brightest point. It's just gonna be a very satisfying display, especially for competitive gamers out there that are gonna play those really high frame rate titles like Overwatch, Valorant, CSGO, Fortnite, those kinds of titles. Now I'm gonna say it right now, the GS66 Stealth has my favorite 15-inch laptop keyboard. This thing has a great layout. The font is a little bit big, which is a little funky, but the feel, the shunk of the keys is great. It's much improved from the GS65 Stealth that I tried a couple years ago. We got full-size arrow keys, dedicated page up, page down, home and end buttons, and the backlight is beautiful, highlighting every single symbol on the machine. The touchpad on this thing is fantastic. It's enormous. It's super wide. Is it possible to make a trackpad too wide? In this case, maybe. After using it for several days, I still was accidentally touching it with my palm constantly right over here because I just naturally rest my wrist right there, and then it just would minimize all my applications. Got pretty annoying. That said, I think over time I would adapt to it and I wouldn't have accidental touches anymore. I did not have accidental touches when typing, but that will depend a lot on each person's hand placement when they type on a computer. It is possible to click all around the touchpad, even in the top corners, so really nice all-around design on the touchpad. Now the build quality on this machine is top-notch with like two caveats. First of all, MSI has had problems with the display hinge in the past. MSI claims to have improved it on this model, but only time will tell if MSI has fixed their hinge problems. It looks great, it feels great to me. If I was buying this laptop, I'd probably buy an extended warranty. That's just my honest opinion, just for the hinge alone. The other issue with the build quality that I have is the creaky flex on the bottom of the laptop. Let me see if I can make it happen for you. Basically, every time you pick up the laptop, it's gonna creak a little bit because there's a little bit of flex in the very bottom middle. The good thing is the top is just like insanely strong. Like, look at how little flex. I'm pushing down really hard and there's basically no flex in this machine at all, except in the bottom middle. Really impressed with the GS66 build quality overall. Now, this does come with Windows Hello, which is just so fantastic. It's an IR camera that allows for increased security for facial recognition, and it allows you to log into your laptop just super quick. You flip it open, it recognizes your face. Let me just go ahead and demonstrate for you. And it's recognized me and logged in. It takes like 2 seconds. It's so quick. I freaking love it. And for me, now that I've had it on a laptop, it's gonna be hard for me to switch to a laptop that doesn't have Windows Hello. Now, the GS66 features 2 easily accessible M.2 SSD slots, as well as 2 upgradable RAM slots. You just gotta take the bottom off. Now, I did try to take the bottom off, and I was able to get all the screws out, but actually prying the bottom off is a little bit tricky, and I didn't wanna scratch this review unit, so you're gonna need to make sure that you have a plastic spooger tool, basically to pry it up without scratching it. I need to get one, but my old credit card, which usually does the trick, didn't work on this machine. Now, when it comes to ports, the GS66 Stealth has pretty much everything you'd want. On the left side, we have a USB Type A, an HDMI, a Thunderbolt 3/USB-C/USB-C power delivery port that you can charge up to 100 watts of power delivery, meaning you can use an external battery bank on it if you wish. You also get the power adapter port here on the left. On the right side, we have a headset port, a USB-C port, 2 more USB Type A's, and an Ethernet port. The only port that I think is really missing from this is a full-size SD card reader, which I would use the crap out of if this laptop had it. Now, if we go along this outside of this laptop, you can see how much ventilation we have on this thing. We've got a vent on the left, we got a vent on the back left, a big vent on the back right, and then another big vent on the right side, backside portion. This thing has so much ventilation. It's really impressive thermal design, in my opinion, for a laptop that's this thin and light and small. Now, MSI includes a huge 99 watt-hour battery on this machine, which is great. I love that, and especially considering the small form factor, I love that they prioritized battery size. That's going to give you a little bit more juice than a laptop that has, say, an 80 watt-hour battery. Now, when it comes to battery life, you're looking at about 8 to 9 hours with airplane mode and reduced brightness. You can get about 6 to 7 hours of web surfing, probably about 5 to 6 hours of Netflix time, and maybe like a little bit over 1 hour of playing games under full load. Overall, this is far above average when it comes to battery life for gaming laptops, so 2 giant thumbs up here. Now, I do want to mention that I did have some issues with the GPU switching. It took restarting the machine, taking it out of GPU switching mode and putting it back into that mode for me to get it to actually work on the laptop. So it might be a little bit finicky. You might have some issues there like I did. I got it working fine eventually. It just took a little bit of effort. In conclusion, do I recommend the GS66 Stealth? Absolutely, but also with a couple of caveats. If you're someone who absolutely wants the most performance in as slim a package as possible, this is one of the laptops you should be looking at. I mean, it's got great battery life, it's got a solid display, it's got good overall thermals, especially for the GPU. It's a little bit toasty on the CPU, but it's manageable. It's not like horrific. If you're really worried about the CPU temps, just run it on max fan and set a slightly lower power limit on the CPU, and you'll have superb thermals, just like you would, for example, on the Razer Blade Pro that has reduced power limits as well. I love the overall design and the build quality, the keyboard, the trackpad. There's so much to love about this device. So what are the device's weaknesses? Well, first of all, I would say the speakers are just a real bummer in my opinion. They're loud, but they're not very clear. So if you really want great speakers, you're probably gonna wanna skip this laptop. Another downside to this laptop is that you cannot undervolt it and therefore get slightly better temperatures and increased performance, which is not that big of a deal, but for those of us that love to undervolt, it is a downside. Now, of course, there's no SD card slot, which is a bummer for me. That's a big downside. And the last major negative is that creaky underside flex. I think most gamers out there would love to pull this machine out of their backpack and use it all freaking day. It's a great all-around device. That's it for my review of the GS66. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. I will see you in the next one. Brandon out. Whew.